Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good day to all of you. Thank you for being here with us today. My name is Anthony Mills. I'm the Executive Director of GI&I, Global Innovation Institute, based in the United States. And today is Wednesday, November 19th, 2025. And this is our November 2025 webinar. So I want to thank you for joining us. As most of you know, Global Innovation Institute is the world's leading professional certification and business accreditation organization in the field of applied business innovation. And we work with authorized providers all over the world in every major country and delivering our programs and helping people become certified and organizations becoming accredited, which we have around the world as well. So I just want to thank you if you're joining us live today, or if you're watching the recording, thank you for being a part of this community. What I'd like to do now is to introduce to you our guest speaker today, tell you a little bit about him, and after I introduce him, I will turn it over to him to give us his presentation. So our guest today is Mr. Josh Barker. Josh is the CEO of City Innovations, a venture studio helping organizations to launch and scale new products with real market traction. He's also the chief traction engine builder at Traction Labs, the home of the Traction First mindset, where he helps leaders to design and build traction engines, which are working engines that bring marketing, sales, and product teams all three together into one cohesive system. And that work focuses on new ventures, diversification strategies, stalled initiatives, and navigating market shifts. Josh is furthermore a board member at Think Tank Thought Leadership, a business that's shaping the future of expert thought leadership by empowering experts to effortlessly amplify their influence through AI-powered content creation that transforms a single recording session into premium long-form videos, podcasts, social media content, blogs, and even books. Josh is also a mentor at the Polsky Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the University of Chicago, where he advises entrepreneurs on all things pertaining to building the right digital product, what to build, how to build it, and then leading them and actually building it. Because after all, anyone can build something, but not everyone can build the right thing. The most expensive mistake is to build the wrong thing. Prior to all of this, Josh was the co-founder and CTO of Rallyall, a Silicon Valley funded startup that developed a fitness challenge game called Exert, which combined elements of both competition and camaraderie. Prior to that, Josh was the co-founder and managing partner at Luma Solutions, an innovation-driven software development firm. Josh also spent nearly 4 years working as the manager and then associate director of innovative solutions at KPMG US, prior to which he was a software engineer and manager at several small and medium enterprises here in the US. Josh is the author of several books, including Traction First, The 12 Laws of Market Traction, and Traction First, A Corporate Innovator's Guide to Unlocking Market Traction. So today, Josh is going to be sharing with us the key principles of his book, Traction First: How Corporate Innovators Turn Ideas into Real Market Impact, where he will explore how innovation can shift from internal innovation theater to external traction by validating problems. This is important to all of us because too many corporate innovation programs look great on paper, but never really make it into the marketplace. So that's a very important subject for us all. So with that, I'll turn it over now to you, Josh. Join me, everyone, if you will, in welcoming Mr. Josh Barker. Josh, the floor is all yours.
I appreciate it, Anthony. Awesome. Well, it's a pleasure to be here in front of you, all you guys, to discuss some of this traction first stuff. And that was usually the introductions are usually, hey, this is Josh. So it was very grandiose introduction. So thank you, Anthony. I appreciate that. So I usually have this about me slide. I'm going to kind of skim through it. It's funny. I usually divide this into two things when I give introductions about myself. Is one, I call it the fun stuff and then the work stuff. So Anthony, you hit on the work stuff. So I'll kind of be lighter on the work stuff, but the fun stuff. So I live in Grand Rapids, Michigan, married with three kids. I'm a DIYer, a nerd, homesteader. That surprises many people. It's a good yin to yang balance of daily innovation to working with my hands. And so, as Anthony mentioned, a little bit of my background is working from a software engineering standpoint. And I always like to joke with people that I defected to innovation and marketing, more on that side of the fence. So, this presentation will come through that lens of innovation. So the question, that I like to start with is like, why does most corporate innovation never make it to market? And I'm sure many of you here that are talking and are in corporate innovation, you've seen things like beautiful strategy decks that have taken hours and hours and hours of time. Anthony mentioned my work at KPMG and a lot of the Fortune 500. There was decks that were hundreds of pages long, and so they were beautiful and big budget portfolios, lots of activity, but in the end, a lot of these projects ended up with very little adoption, right? So no matter how beautiful of the plan we put together, it ended up just kind of fading. And so this leads to, as Anthony mentioned, this leads to innovation theater versus market traction, right? So I'm sure many of you here are familiar with that term innovation theater. It makes it look like you're doing a lot of cool things in innovation. And a lot of times this manifests itself with internal pitches, innovation labs, innovation workshops, versus actually going out in the market and doing the actual hard work of customer validation, getting demand signals, and real revenue and usage, right? So it's much easier, like we just talked about doing those pretty decks, about doing those pitches, about doing those labs. I kind of call it flash in the pan innovation, where it's just, hey, let's just come together and do a quick innovation workshop, and we'll call that innovation. And that ends up being more theater than actual traction. And I'm sure many of you here can resonate with some of those things because I've been a part of many. I'm sure many of you have been a part of them too. So how do we fix this? Right? So that's the problem. So then how do we actually fix this? And that's really what I've spent a lot of my career thinking through is, working from startups, in the Valley all the way to corporate innovation. I kind of joke with people that my career is a lot like a sine wave where I'll go and found a company and then come back and kind of quote unquote, someone I think even mentioned this, do you hide in larger companies? And it's like to recuperate and then go get the gusto to do another one. And so that's been my career of being an entrepreneur and then an entrepreneur. And so how do we end up fixing this is like usually we have a build first mentality, right? Startups have this, corporations have this, where in a corporation what that looks like is a lot of internal advocating, right? It's getting alignment, it's creating those decks. We mentioned decks, it's creating and vocalizing, here's what we are thinking about doing, here's the strategy. And there's months and months of that. There's even up to years of talk, right? Lots of talk, and then finally, we get the budget approval and we get to a build phase. Then we end up spending a year, 2 years building something. And then finally, as an after fact, we then go, great, let's go this whiz bang launch. And then we chase adoption, right? And then we realize only 2, 3, 4 years into it, was it a bad idea, or was it maybe a couple degrees off, or maybe it requires a whole rewrite, or maybe a slight rewrite, right? So that's usually the kind of the pattern we see as a build first mentality versus a traction first mentality. And so, Anthony mentioned we've really coined the term traction first. Traction first to us means flipping that script and saying validating demand first, proving there's traction, then starting to make the investment, right? So for those of you that are familiar with lean startup, with customer development from Steve Blank, a lot of those kinds of terms, there's a lot of infusion of those kind of methodologies and those thought processes in the traction first mindset. So that's kind of some of the origins of where traction first came from. Some of the things we like to talk about too with traction first is really it's about building a traction engine first before you try to run it. A lot of times when I talk with executives, I talk about the difference between building versus running, right? So if you're building a traction engine, a lot of times executives mistake a stalled business, something that's not growing, an innovation initiative that's not succeeding. They mistake that as we need to put more sales and more marketing behind this initiative, right? So they pour more gas and it ends up just falling all over the floor. And it's when in reality, it's not that the fuel indicator light's coming on, it's actually that the check engine light's on. It's saying that the business model fundamentally needs to change. And so really that's what we like to educate people on is the traction engine itself is the thing you put $1 in and you can reliably get 10 out. And that's the thing we want to concentrate on first at the business model level. So it's front loading all of the, rather than building first, how can I validate the business model before I actually invest huge amounts of money into trying to scale a business model? Because a lot of people want to scale it first. And so there's this other analogy of, usually innovation flows on two sides. And it's usually I see it on the right side. We call this the messy middle. Usually there's this heavy strategy emphasis. So coming from the Fortune 500, coming from KPMG, there's a lot of emphasis on getting the right strategy. And as we all know here, strategy is incredibly important. But then there's another side of the coin where a lot of people focus on also the boots to crown kind of tactical, the execution. So those are like the engineers, the developers, if it's a digital product. It's like we're going to bring this to market, we're going to go fast, we're going to run Scrum, we're going to do all the things. But really the messy middle is where the value is. And I like to say here that no product survives first impact with customers, right? So no matter how good the strategy is, no matter what you've developed. And so if you can front load that risk, that's all about what Traction First is about, front loading the risk of understanding what customers want. That's exactly kind of the Traction First mindset. All of that has come into fruition of like how do you get a traction first mindset, and that's where I came up with this book, Traction First: The 12 Laws of Market Traction. And so in the book it really comes from a lens of my journey through Silicon Valley. So I like to share people that with people through this book that I'm definitely, you'll read it and you'll go, wow, this guy made a lot of mistakes. And that's exactly why I wrote the book, because I want people to avoid those same mistakes that I made when I was out in the valley of trying to, build this whiz bang thing that took 6 months to a year and then ending up having very little traction. And so that pattern is not just for startups, right? If we kind of go over to the next slide here, it's for mid-market, emerging markets, corporate innovation alike, is that same mentality applies if you're reading Lean Startup. A lot of people who haven't read the book that are corporate innovators that I talk with, they go, that's for startups. And you look at it and you go, no, that is like pivotal required reading to understand how do you front load the risk? How do you divide the risk into much smaller pieces? And so that is all about what traction first means. So the pattern is universal. So the first law, I want to go through some of the laws and really apply it to corporate innovation because, like I mentioned, the book, while it's written with from a lens of startups and my journey in the valley, it is highly, highly applicable to us in corporate innovation. And that's where I think some of the importance is even more so because of a lot of the techniques of or a lot of the things that we do, like having a tendency towards building strategy decks, having a tendency towards alignment meeting after alignment meeting after alignment meeting versus saying, let's just experiment, right? So the first law is sell first, build later. And if you're a corporate innovator, a lot of times I hear people when I share this, they immediately think of the word sell, and that kind of throws them off. And they're like, "Well, we don't sell anything. We're innovating something new." And that's where I talk to them and I say, no, actually, if your product is in the market, you're obviously going to sell something. Or if your product is internal, if you're trying to do an internal innovation effort, you're still having to sell conceptually a concept to an internal team, right? Internal team or the organization at large. So the idea behind sell first, build later is exactly what Traction First is about, is don't build anything until you've proven someone actually wants it, right? And the example I like to give is Kickstarter, right? So while that's very startup-y and people, there's some people that even say, well, how can you do that when it doesn't exist? I often like to use this tactic very simply in corporate innovation of what would it look like to create a one-page offer to see who raises their hand? Very simply, a lot of people think they need a website, they need a really fancy pitch deck, when in reality, they just need to explain what problem they're solving. And if it tugs on enough heartstrings of that problem, we'll talk about this in another law, that they'll actually, will they actually pull out their wallets and pay for it? So if you can get that indication up front, that's where the value is. Understanding if you can get that pre-commitment, you're understanding you're solving a key pain point. Sell first, build later. So the second law is really sell to learn, not to scale. So these are very similar laws, the first two. Um, Again, sell first, build later is a little bit different in the fact that we're talking about order. First, you want to sell, then you want to scale, right? So this is talking about sell to learn. So it's not talking about ordering. It's actually talking about the process of selling is how you learn, right? So sell to learn. So the selling is the fastest way to learn what customers value and what they'll pay for, right? So in the book, I talk about my startup journey. And so one of the things, if you guys do end up reading the book, and if you stick around to the end, I'm going to give away some free copies of the book. So when you read it, what you find out is I was involved with a fitness startup. So Anthony mentioned Rally All. So that's actually a fitness startup. And in that, I can tell you there is a chasm of difference between intent and actual action. And that's what we're kind of talking about here is collapsing that intent versus action of how can you get people to when you're talking to them to not just say, I want to work out, but actually showing and demonstrating they are actually working out. They're actually using it. And so this is where, I like to say the mentality here is think customer interviews. We all know customer interviews, the importance of talking with customers, but it's customer interviews with teeth. I like to use that because it ends up saying, put your money where your mouth is, right? It's like pull out your wallet and show me that there's some real intent here. So the tactic here, is can you run 10 sales conversations in 14 days and want to pilot this next week, right? Some very simple tactics of understanding. And in an organization, again, sales conversations doesn't have to mean pulling out a wallet. It just means how can you shrink intent to action? So what can you get them to do to commit to something that causes you to believe there actually is something there rather than just saying, oh yeah, that's a great idea, but they're very non-committal. They don't have to commit to anything. So that's sell to learn, not to scale. So law number three is solve real pain, not self-made vitamins. So if you're really in a lot of pain, my wife had a migraine the other day. If you're in a lot of pain, I saw her just tearing open the medicine cabinet trying to find the aspirin, right? And that's what we mean here is like you literally if you're in pain, you're going to take an aspirin, you're going to take pain medication. But if you're talking about a vitamin, you could skip 1, 2, 3, 4 days and really not feel the effects. And it's obviously there's long-term effects and benefits to vitamins, but there's not that immediate, this is super painful, right? So a lot of what I talk about with corporate executives is talking about making sure the pain is urgent enough. Otherwise, the project ends up dying before it even starts, right? So if we can't validate that there's a customer problem fit, that the actual end customer or user of what we're talking about, whether that's an employee or that is an outside, person you're selling to, you're maybe building public facing innovation, you're dead in the water. And so really what I recommend to people is reading, for those of you, a good mom test. It's a small, thin book that talks about customer interviews where we're not sharing, the reason it's called the mom test is we're not sharing, hey, what do you think of this idea? Because if you said that to your mom, she's going to say, it's a great idea, sweetie, right? Because she loves you. And so we as humans don't want to let each other down, and we don't like to have conflict a lot. Most of us in the world, some of us do, but most of us don't. And so we want to avoid that uncomfortable situation by just saying it's a great idea. And so how can we get to understanding, is it a core pain point? And so for here, the mentality is think painkillers only, right? How do we make sure it's actually a pain enough to take the aspirin? So law 4 brings us to speed to learning over activity as progress. This one's a really good one for corporate innovation, especially because I was mentioning decks. That's a great, while strategy is very important, there becomes a point when you're iterating on the deck that you're literally iterating on pixels, right? That goes for websites, that goes for branding, that goes for anything in that area where you're sitting here going, if you're putting all this effort into it, there's a high likelihood early stage things are going to change. We're all in the innovation space. So understanding that that likely will change. And so understanding what is activity and what is going to move the needle in terms of signal. And really, I talk a lot about the thing that you can measure is speed to learning and saying that's really the thing that matters the most early stages is how fast are you learning about who your user is, who your customer is, again, whether that's employees or out in the marketplace. So that's the only thing that counts at this early stage. A lot of people then ask, well, how do you move faster? And this is where the mentality comes in. It's interesting because a lot of people think that having innovation is more like a rodeo where it's just like Wild West. We're going to go out and have no process and just figure things out and just really try and R&D things. But where I've really seen speed gain is when you start to bring in the scientific method for customers, I call it. When you start to get really organized around your process of learnings and you say, what is my hypothesis? And actually measure it up and have it be measurable to say, what did we learn? Was it validated, invalidated? You then can start to build momentum because there is clarity. And so that's really what I like to talk about when we talk about speed to learnings. So the tactic is very simple. Oftentimes I tell teams you can just simply start by saying holding a weekly learning huddle and say, what did we learn? What did we validate this week? What can we kill? Right. So that often changes the narrative behind we have to do all these things. Again, speed to learning over activity. We have to do all these things to, well, what are we actually learning? A lot of teams can be actually challenged highly just by asking that question is what did we learn? So law 5 here is very lean startup-esque, small experiments, not large bets. So this is where it's test small before you request anything big. So I've seen a lot of pilots at corporations fail because they've gone too grandiose with things, right? When they've said, hey, what I need for a pilot is $250,000 or $500,000 in 6 months. And that is no longer an experiment. That is a bet. That is a large bet. And so how can you shrink the amounts of bets into much, much smaller things? So we're talking 1, 2, 3 week things that we're actually testing in the market and we're gauging actual consumer or customer or user activity and saying, is there actual interest? And we can validate this before we make more investment into it, right? And this is the how behind how we validate is through these small experiments rather than large bets. So, the tactic here, run a 5K micro pilot, right? That could be having conversations with customers. It could be literally putting up a landing page if you're external in the market with, for corporations, oftentimes the concern is, I don't want to tarnish my brand if I'm running all these experiments. How do I avoid brand tarnishment? And for us, it's a lot of, hey, creativity of saying, hey, some of these brands will just create a new brand that's completely unattached to the core brand, right? So KPMG was very concerned about their brand image, right? Their brand image was everything. So in order to have that speed, autonomy was key, is having autonomy, having an autonomous unit that could operate outside the bounds, that was unattached, that if an experiment failed, there'd be no egg on anyone's face. Right. So no one would know the wiser. And so that's a little bit of what we mean is how can you experiment and do that with small experiments, not large bets. Law 6, we talk a lot about pursuing traction and not strategy decks. I've mentioned strategy decks probably 10 times already in this conversation. And so again, I said this earlier is not I didn't say I said no product survives first impact. We also say no first plan. Right. So it's not just the product, it's also the plan that doesn't survive first impact. Right. So we also have to reframe corporate innovators' minds to say, what we think and what we think is a good idea as a corporate innovation team is a hypothesis until proven by the actual market and the actual users, right? So anything over that is it's just an experiment, right? And that's what we have to phrase it as is it's literally an experiment. And so for us, we're very evidence driven and we're saying from a traction first mentality, be evidence driven over elegance. So you could have the most elegant plan. In the book I described, the traction first book, I described how in the valley my partner and I spent months just kind of whiteboarding different pricing models and different things. And then when we actually got to market, all of the work with pricing models, all of the work with partnerships, all of the work, a lot of that was thrown away because when it actually hit the market, it was vastly different than what we assumed. Um, that's where you end up challenging those folks where the highest paid person's opinion who's in the room. You have to make sure that you're also laddering it against evidence in the market and being very market driven. So the tactic here I like to say is swap roadmap reviews for traction reviews, right? So show the real usage, show commitments. So I just got out of a conversation earlier today with one of our customers that we were talking about having what meant more from a traction perspective is getting letters of intent. So he's a B2B business. And so we were talking about showing evidence with actually getting letters of intent versus actual just, hey, we think this is a good idea. We have all the plan in the world, but until we get LOIs on the desk, it doesn't really mean anything. Law seven, this is really near and dear to my heart. Stay scrappy and hands-on, not flawless and automated. This also makes people very uncomfortable, especially from a corporate standpoint, is what do we mean by this? And I like to say manual beats automated until the workflow is proven. And the reason for that is actually there's multiple reasons for that. When I go into an organization and I see someone that a lot of the system is driven off of spreadsheets, as an engineer, my background in engineering, we would normally be the guys to make fun of that and go, oh my gosh, like they're building their whole business off of a spreadsheet. Can you believe that? It's crazy. Their whole thing's going to crumble and die. But now I look at this from a different lens of corporate innovation traction first, and I look at it and I go, that's actually really smart how they started with a spreadsheet and they actually outgrew it. Because what ended up happening is they started with a spreadsheet and they adapted that spreadsheet very nimbly as they needed it to, so they could fully understand the scope in a progressive manner rather than kind of buying something up front that they didn't need. They got to use that spreadsheet to fully understand what their needs were with the business. And that applies to customers and users. So when we're talking about getting your first 10 customers, this is even more important, whether they're employees or outside of the market, by literally white gloving them through the process. You are giving yourself that attachment to customers and users that you wouldn't have. Because too often I've seen innovators want to build glass panes between customers to say, we're going to build a platform, we're going to scale this thing. And while that's a great vision and we all want to get there, what you're sacrificing is while it's cool, automation is cool and it makes it look hip and awesome. The issue is you sacrifice the relationship then with your customers to fully understand what they're saying, what they're feeling, what they want. And so this is really an opportunity to stay close to customers and stay close to users to fully understand it and progressively build it. So oftentimes the mentality we like to say is Google Sheet MVP. So if you were to read my book, you would see that there's a whole chapter based on this of how we actually we learned through pain this technique of how do you stay scrappy and hands-on. So the thought is how do you run an MVP with a Google Sheet, right, in a shared inbox? I like to say high manual touch, low fidelity is really like powerful to start. Law 8, build momentum in weeks, not plans and quarters. So with this, there's so much cultural, as we know within corporate innovation, there's so much culture that's already been pre-established. And so with this, oftentimes there's this culture of we can't do things without permission. And so the one thing that I have to help people tweak their mindset on is think about this in terms of running small experiments. We just talked about small experiments. And so how can we create a culture that allows small experimentation? Because what we're actually doing is being good stewards of the organization because we're actually de-risking it. A lot of people look at experimentation as a dirty word and they say, we don't like experimenting. That's not cool. We look at it as how do we de-risk risk, right? There's a bunch of risks, and the biggest risk you could have is actually going out to market and just building this big whiz bang thing that we have a vision that we just had in the boardroom with four people, rather than actually saying, well, what's the smallest, rightest thing that we can actually do to test this thing? So I was mentioning LOIs that with a customer just about an hour or two ago. In that conversation, how it actually started was this grandiose vision that this entrepreneur had of a mid-sized market business. They're a SaaS platform. They had this idea of really, I mean, it would really transform them in the marketplace, but it's a 2, 3 year plan of actually a huge rebuild, new SaaS product, new functionality. And so our job was to rewind him and say, I think that's a wonderful plan. I think that's actually really smart. It's actually then to divide it into how do we de-risk this? And that's where we came up with, well, what if we were to get LOIs before you were actually to embark on this, right? Sell first, build later mentality, right? So we ingrained in this customer this thought of it's okay to run, just let's just run a quick test. No harm in running a quick test. And so, of course, you've got to get alignment around what is a test and making sure the brand tarnishment is not a thing. But besides that, giving empowerment to run these small tests. So pilot something small, build momentum, could be with an internal stakeholder, right? If you want to go a little bit lower risk route, internal stakeholder or a friendly customer, right? So to gather feedback before you kind of move forward. So again, changing a little bit of the mindset of just running small experiments and that it's okay to run these small experiments. Law number 9, adopt adaptive models, not rigid frameworks. So with this one, it's really interesting because early innovation needs flexibility, not frameworks. And what I want to make sure I really define this, because if I were to stop there, I think a lot of people would, you'd get the process oriented people in the room that might flip tables over and be like, what are you talking about? We have to have some kind of process. And that is true. I'm not advocating for no process. What I am advocating for is to take a critical look at frameworks that businesses are using today within corporate innovation. And I put an example on the right side, which is if you guys are familiar with EOS, so the entrepreneurial operating system, there's StratOp, there's SAFe, there's Scrum, there's all of these frameworks, and they're really helpful frameworks. I'm going to very much articulate that. But where we have to understand is the fact that if we are in the innovation team responsible for new things that are coming to market, a lot of these frameworks were developed around an assumption that the business model has been figured out. And so that's really important to understand because a lot of businesses that I interact with, they want to run this innovation process through a specific framework. And they say, we want to plan this in quarters, we want to plan our year. What do you need at this spend level? And the issue ends up being is if you're doing it right, you're actually learning even week to week what your market wants from an internal employee standpoint or from a market standpoint, right? So either side, it's such rapid learnings that you have to make sure you're using the right tools for the job and that you're not locking yourselves into creating and casting a vision that is in quarters and years when in fact you need that agility to move much to pivot much quicker. So the thought is think flexible learning frameworks only, right? How can you take things and make them flexible? And so um, the tactic here is you can obviously there's tactics of adapting frameworks. We've done a lot of adaptation. A lot of times we'll go into an organization and they'll have these rigid frameworks. We'll have to adapt and help them by saying things like, hey, instead of we're going to have these goals done, these things done by this quarter, we're going to need to have X amount of learnings by the end of quarter, right? So it's more learning focused and then be able to have those kinds of learnings. So another way is to run a framework fast, right? So like change the framework if that's allowed. Now that's again in corporate innovation, you kind of have to also be adaptable. And so sometimes this isn't possible to run a framework fast, but no government's only learning loops, but the hyper focus is really should be on learning. Law 10, align growth teams and don't tolerate silos. So I'd like to say innovation dies when sales, product, and marketing are in silos, right? So those are key parts of the business. So sales is really the front lines of conversations with customers, right? They're fully understanding, and that's where you're getting as that is the front lines of understanding what they want, how they react when you're trying to sell something, how they react to how you message something. And that's the same with marketing as well, right? On the front end of things of understanding and measuring how are people engaging with your content, what is hitting in the market, what's not. And then product is kind of the tail end of that of understanding all of those ingredients. How does it then apply and how does it scale from there and getting more customers, right? So if one of the biggest things we've noticed is that in organizations, many of them are working towards separate goals, right? So they're measured on separate stats and they're not cohesive. They're not moving in the same direction. And they're also not openly sharing learnings. So it's talking about getting the people in the room, especially those closest to the customer, and having daily or every other day conversations on what you're building so that you can take those learnings and immediately adapt. So a great example of this is one of our customers working with and releasing a new product in the market. What they recognized in sales was they recognized very quickly after picking up the phone and dialing their end customer is actually a CFO. And so as they were talking to CFOs, their product that they were developing was one of trying to find hidden profits, right, in within their kind of P&L. And so one of the things as they were trying to advertise, marketing was hitting hard on we help you find hidden profits. Sales found out very quickly in sales conversations over a couple hundred, if not thousands, of sales conversations over the last couple months that when we analyzed that using AI, we found that actually CFOs felt threatened by that message. They actually said, well, that's my job. So what sales brought that up, was able to talk with marketing about it. Marketing that's had this aha moment of, oh my gosh, well, no wonder we're having problems with traction and getting in the market. They switched their messaging instead to act more like an aid rather than a threat. Right. So they said something like, hey, did you know that your largest customer actually might be your least profitable? All of a sudden that really was the aha moment of unlocking growth. And that couldn't have happened if they weren't in the same team. So they literally, that was found out in a stand up, and that stand up led to several conversations. And so that stand up was between product, sales, and marketing all coming together. So we like to say one traction team, one customer. So it's as simple as saying, let's just get people in the room and do like a 20 to 50, 15 to 20-minute stand up to say, what are we learning? That's the emphasis. Like, what are we learning about customers, right? And then start cataloging all your learnings and be able that's really where a lot of aha moments come from. Law 11 here, engineer growth engines don't rely on lucky breaks. I mentioned at the very beginning of the presentation that um, when we're talking about engineering these growth engines or these traction engines, a lot of people want to pour fuel. And so another way we've seen this is like it says in the key point here, traction is designed, not accidental or based on rainbows and unicorns. And I say this specifically because a lot of people have these Hail Mary moments where they go, actually, I think if we just hire this whiz bang consultant, that whiz bang consultant is going to be the saving grace of us, or that whiz bang salesperson or marketer or team or whatever it is, they kind of Hail Mary it. And so that's where we've never really seen that pan out in the long run. Where we've seen it really pan out is when people concentrate on creating repeatable loops and processes of how do you get faster with learning about your customers, learning about the end result of what you're doing. And so if you're focusing on shortening those cycles, focusing on learnings, creating, that's how you create these growth engines, is you actually focus on that cycle. So if you can focus on that, create, and the simple thing that you could do from a tactic standpoint is create and document your speed to learning's repeatable process. So we've created our own kind of operating system as we're working with customers that is the how behind what we do. And that really has been the secret sauce because we've been able to do that repeatably. And so if you're focusing on how can we learn as fast as possible through some of the earlier tactics that I mentioned, like the 15 to 20-minute meeting, focusing on how do you get those learnings, that's where we see the greatest impact. So the last law here is traction first, everything else second. So if it hasn't proven traction, it doesn't deserve to scale, right? And this is where we talk about, hey, this is why traction first exists, because it allows you to quickly sift through what's a good idea, what's a bad idea, not based off of, I call it Kentucky windage, not based off of one of these where you're licking your finger to put it up in the air to see where the wind blows, but by data, right? To say, no, we can actually quantitatively say this isn't a good idea because we've tried it. We tried running these multiple small experiments. We tried running, doing traction first. We tried proving it, and it didn't work. So the mentality here is being able to prove it or pause it, right? So in organizations, it's really important. The one of the things that we've seen is people dragging this seemingly dead body around that this startup or this early inside venture of a company or this early innovation effort really deserves to die, but they keep dragging it and keep moving it on and on and on, when in fact, the best thing to do is have clarity and to start measuring things and saying, we should kill this. We should really stop because it's adding a lot of burden to an organization. So um, that's where the focus should be, is no scaling until someone pays or uses it, set a time frame, say after 30 days, as just an example. So the summary and takeaway here is, traction isn't magic, right? So it's momentum created through disciplined learning. That's hopefully what you got out of this, is like we're really being focused on that learning process. So building a lot less, learning a lot faster, staying close to customers, running these small tests, scaling only what works. So that's why we say traction first, everything else second. So from a corporate innovation standpoint, if you're inside a larger organization, you guys should view this as you actually, your advantage is actually your access, right? So it's, you have access to real customers. Some, now, granted, what I will say as a sub comment to this, there's a lot of organizations we work with that have gatekeepered their customers, right? So how do you, there's different ways and tactics of navigating. If you cannot have access, they don't allow you access to customers. But a lot of organizations, obviously they're pre-existing. They have customers, they have distribution, they have reputation, they have budget, they have data. These are all strategic advantages, and you can use them to your advantage in your innovation process. So the challenge in corporate innovation is often speed, right? So it's like, how do you cut through that speed? The opportunity you have is getting is traction. So here's some things, just to sum it up. Here's some things you can do tomorrow. You can create a one-page offer of your idea, right? We talked about that at the very beginning. As an example tactic, you can create a one-page offer. You can go shop it around, beat it up. You can have 3 customer conversations, right? You can sit down with 3 customers. You can run one tiny test, one that won't, maybe, at first tarnish the brand, make sure it doesn't tarnish it, but run one tiny test, see what happens. Kill one assumption that isn't validated. Share learnings, right? That's the biggest thing, is like, if we don't share, that's really the accelerator behind everything. So share learnings with the team. So the other thing is I'll add it here. Read the book, Traction First, 12 Laws of Market Traction. If you guys want a free copy for attending this webinar, put your email in the chat, and I'll get with Anthony, see if I can get those emails, and we can actually give you a free copy. So I'll pause. This brings us to the end of our time. So as you guys have questions, I'll kind of open it up. If there's any questions with anything you guys have, happy to have a conversation on it.
Thank you very much, Josh. Excellent, 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 excellent. And so, for everyone in the audience, this is the opportunity for you to take some time and ask Josh questions about what he's presented, and add any comments you care to add this, and we'll discuss them with Josh. And I'll just kind of kick it off with a few questions for you, Josh, if I may, and we'll discuss those while the rest of the audience is thinking of some questions here. By the way, everyone says amazing presentation. Thank you very much. So the first question, Josh, is letters of intent. I mean, okay, so first, actually, there's 2 parts of this. An organization gives you a letter of intent. How much on the hook are they? Are they truly committed, or they could walk away from that at any point? And the other part of that is some organizations go further and they ask for pre-orders. Think of the Tesla Cybertruck. They took pre-orders. So I'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions on all that.
I would say, if you have a sliding scale from verbal commitment, this is where it is. The verbal commitment to pay, like pull out wallet and pay. Pull out wallet and pay is by far the best. So LOI, that was literally, like I was mentioning an hour or two ago. The CEO, we were pushing him towards pre-orders. that was like the maximum I was pushing them towards and saying, let's get
Mhm.
pre-orders. He personally didn't feel comfortable, and that's some of working in corporate innovation is you have to compromise and work with your stakeholders. And so that's where it's like, well, let's start with an LOI. And so it's like that's a little bit down in the scale. So if you can get people to pull out their wallets, that is ultimately the best.
Yeah, yeah. So I like the way you put that as a spectrum, and that's a good way to frame it. A spectrum with, the ultimate being the pre-orders, where they really have put their money where their mouth is, and then somewhere down there, letters of intent that have varying levels of true commitment behind them. But the more committed you can get people to be, obviously, the better. The more proof you have. Um, the so there's a question here. Um, Let me see here. I need to know more about when I should kill my product and stop working on it anymore. Also, is it going to kill my product if I offer a free trial to know more about the attraction it may have? You want to address that?
Yeah, so I need to know more about when I should kill my product and stop working on it anymore. Yeah, really, I mean, there's multiple factors to to the answer. One is, in the book, what I mentioned is we killed our product after there's team burnout. So like that actually is probably far too long to carry it along. So that was probably 3 years in. Usually you get team burnout about 2 or 3 years in. So that's one. The other one is what we should have done, and I'll mention what we should have done is we should have been a lot more, we should have measured things a lot better. And so what I would encourage Mesa here to do is like if you guys haven't put in metrics in place of measurements and setting those goals of saying those hypotheses of saying how many users can we get by X, by making hypothesis and being very exact about numbers, you then can actually have very binary answers to your question, right? Like, should we kill it or shouldn't we? And the discussion with your team is to say, as a team, what is success? And very clearly defining success, because then you can actually say, did we
Hmm.
hit it? And like make a commitment to say
Hmm.
during a time frame, X time frame, if we haven't achieved Y, we're going to actually hit the abort button. And so putting that ahead of time is very, very, very helpful. Um, the other looks like the second part of this is also, is it going to kill my product if I offer a free trial to know more about the attraction I might have? Um, it's interesting. So when I was out in Silicon Valley, we did a pitch competition. We did a pitch competition with, and one who was on the actual one of the judges' seats was from Google Ventures. I'll never forget the gentleman that said this is, we were looking to add a paywall in front of what we were doing because initially it was free. He challenged us a lot to say, I think that what you're going to do is chop off your learnings by the knees, which was a really interesting response. And he advocated for keeping it free in the early stages, very much so, because really, a lot of stakeholders want revenue and they want fast revenue. The issue ends up being is there's this tension because have you learned enough to actually start charging people to pay for it, right? So the biggest thing that I would advocate for is if you can get people to pay for it when you feel like you've already nailed the aspirin problem, what to solve, and you really have a high level of confidence that you're solving the right problem and your solution's the correct solution, obviously start charging for it as soon as you can. So like we just talked about, advocating for getting money through the door because that's the best level of intent. However, if you're early stages and you're more in customer discovery still, I would advocate for just free or low cost or discounted because you're still trying to figure it out, right? So the learnings are far more
Yeah.
important.
And I think another, going back to rule number 12 and killing it, or principle 12 and killing it is another thing we run into in corporate environments is pet projects. Like this is some executive's pet project. He doesn't want to let go of it. He or she doesn't want to let go of it. And I think, I guess the only way around that is for organizations to collectively commit to the discipline of defining this is what success looks like and agreeing that if we don't hit this, we're going to kill it. I mean, what's your experience on pet projects,
I'm sorry, Anthony, you
Josh?
broke up. You broke up. I think I got what you were saying. Is
Okay, yeah.
if you have an executive sponsor that this is their pet project, is that right? Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
So
Yes,
this is
exactly.
where I would definitely use diplomacy here, where the diplomacy I would use is being invitational and inviting them into the process of, I was mentioning, coming up with a hard, like, hey, X amount of months and defining what success is. and seeing if you can work with a stakeholder to invite them into that process of helping you define that. Because if they're involved in that process of helping you define what success is and by what time, and then ahead of time, them setting what happens if we don't, and then doing a follow through, that's probably the best advice I would give so that they're part of the process and they know up front if this doesn't happen, this is what we're going to end up doing as a team,
Mhm.
and it's decided as a team. So
Yeah. Yeah, I think you agree. It takes that discipline. So Ron asked a question. I think it's a good question. When we think about the adoption of any given new innovation, and there's obviously often those different categories of adopters, including the early adopters, and their rationale and motivations are often different. So Ron wants to know any insight on how to find those early adopters who are more willing.
yeah, it's a good question. It's also very broad because obviously every market is different. So if you look at one customer working with it is in distribution, another one is in high tech, another one is in consulting, right? So if I just listed out all the different industries, the tactics we use to find early adopters really vary by industry, right? Because um, it's kind of asking if you read Crossing the Chasm and you're talking about that, who is the early adopters and who are those people? It generally is people that you ask the question, where do those innovative, like bleeding edge people, as they're thinking about the latest and greatest, where do they hang out, right? It's some industries that's conferences, like because they want to invest in growth and they want to keep growing and be ahead of the competition. Some of that is, we've in the consumer space, some of that is actually weirdly in Reddit. Right. So if you go to Reddit, that's another space you can gather, or forums, right? So you get a lot of those active contributors that are really on the bleeding edge of things, and they're saying try out this new tech. Those people that are open to trying new
Mhm.
things. So that's the kind of people you want, is like those people that try new things. And I know that's a very generic answer, but it's
Mhm.
difficult when you don't have the industry context of what industry. So that's more of some general advice. So
Yeah, and let me add something to that. I think, uh, even if we find the early adopters, as part of our business model, we still need to have a go-to-market strategy that says how we're going to cross the chasm into the mass market. Because some situations, some innovations have failed because, yeah, they got the early adopters to invest, but they were never able to cross the chasm into the mass market, and they hadn't really thought that through in their business model. So I think that's still part of the question to be addressed. I mean, you have any thoughts on yeah, because what their motivation for buying may be different than the mass market, and the question still is over our head. Are we able to address what the motivations are going to be in the mass market? Any further thoughts on that, Josh?
yeah, I think honestly, I think a lot of the customer discovery doesn't stop. And I think that's some of the point is like what you're saying is like you need to do customer discovery on early adopters because what attracted early adopters might not attract mass market. And I think that's what you're stating. And so it's very accurate. And so that's just navigating the customer discovery process of while you're getting early adopters to actually pay and be the first people to pioneer it and work with you on creating it, walking in eyes wide open to understanding the squeaky wheel shouldn't always get the grease of what the early market might be saying might needs to be validated against mass market, right? And so those are different ICPs and customer profiles that you need to make sure that you're upfront almost mapping where does this person fall on this, and making sure you're building something for mass, but at the same time your first focus should be early adopters, right? Because those are going to be the easiest to adopt your platform. So it's a tightrope. It's a balance. It You gotta figure out
Yeah,
both.
I like what you said. Like you're going to start with early adopters, but you're certainly walking in with eyes wide open that, hey, this has to scale beyond early adopters at some point, and it's an ongoing, continuous learning process to learn what you can from the early adopters to answer how we're going to scale this beyond the early adopters into that mass market. So here's a question from Masa. He says, we've worked for 3 years on a SaaS cloud system, and after we have reached that, we found that there are similar products in the market with some different functions and add-ons. should we go compete here or put our focus more on add-ons and functions to make a differentiation? I know this makes us believe that there is attraction for such product, but at the same time, we doubt that there is enough.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a good question. So you've worked on a product, a SaaS product for 3 years, found you reached out, there are similar products. Yeah, this is a common story. So then I think this is where, as you're filling out, one thing that we do is with every single person we work with is we use the lean canvas as a tool. So what this tells me is that there probably should be some emphasis on figuring out what your both your unique value proposition is and your unfair advantage if you're looking at your lean canvas, right? So
Mhm.
that would mean you probably need to understand why a customer would choose you over someone else. And I'm not a huge fan of getting into feature bloodbaths, I call them, of just like one feature to another. I'm a little bit more of a fan of, and this would probably edge on blue ocean of figuring out how do you do it differently? Like what are the competitors all swarming towards, and not going down that same path, because you need a strong enough differentiator to capture market share, right? It's a fallacy that if you build it they will come, right? That's not true, right? So it's understanding why someone would choose you, and it sounds like there's maybe a little bit of work from your team to do look into unfair advantage, and then your unique value prop. That's what would be some 2 cents that I would say.
I 100% agree too, because I think feature wars are just a spiral to the bottom that ultimately end up in price wars. And I think you're 100% right. The question becomes, how can you create that competitive moat by solving the problem in a different way and not just competing on features? Because that never is a winning strategy. So 100%
Yep.
agree on that. And I mentioned here, you mentioned Lean Canvas. That's different than Business Model Canvas. It was a variation of Business Model Canvas developed by Ash Maurya. And I appreciate you said that because for these type situations, I 100% agree that Lean Canvas is a better tool. And I'm glad to see that you're using that. Here's one of the last questions. If there's any more from the audience, feel free to put them in there, but I have this one. So, in corporate innovation, sometimes our threshold for success depends on the size of the organization. So, for example, I used to work for Whirlpool Corporation in corporate innovation and new business creation and trying to launch new product categories. And their threshold was it has to be a $100 million business in order for us to even be interested in it. And some would argue that's something of a mistake. I mean, if you read the book, The Innovator's Solution by Clayton Christensen, he made the argument for keeping business units small so they're hungrier for small pots, and not having such high thresholds. And so I think in corporate environments, that can be a challenge too, is that we set such high thresholds. And just wanted to hear what your opinions or experience in that threshold concept is.
Yeah. Yeah, I can totally resonate with you, the dilemma that you're bringing up, because we see that often. And I mean, it's not just in corporate innovation, it's also in startups, right? Because in the valley there's a lot of who's the next unicorn, right? And if you're
Mhm.
not a unicorn, then what are you doing, right? I don't want to invest in you. But there's this concept of you want to build you don't want to build a unicorn. You want to just build an everyday business that is profitable, right? And so I think there's actually a lot of what we've seen in the marketplace right now. There's actually a trend in a lot of what you're articulating of smaller business units moving in the direction of hungrier and faster innovation, and being able to bring things to market faster, and not having that litmus test of this has to be $100 million thing in order to
Mhm.
to to be to be a good thing to pursue.
Mhm.
So I have seen that in large organizations, but I do see a trend in that changing.
Mhm.
And if you're in an organization that wants those $100 million bets, that is a real challenge. It obviously is, and so it's how can the biggest thing, as I've worked with people in those situations, it's about how can you start small and then work towards the larger vision. And oftentimes, what we've seen is, as that happens, and you're working towards this larger vision, you're able to find opportunities to slice the product vision into pieces, and then that it moves towards the larger vision, but you can start capturing revenue quicker, right? You can start growing things quicker because they're smaller, writer size pieces. So that's
Mhm.
the trend, as well as some of the thing that we have some experience in helping organizations do. So
Yeah, and I would 100% agree with that. I think, there's been the saying that all innovations start out life as an ugly baby, and they often do. And I think part of the art and skill of innovator is having the imagination to be able to see where we could take this, not where it is on day one, but where we could eventually take this, assuming we have traction on, in the beginning, and where we could build on that and scale it. So I think setting our sights on more realistic small goals in the beginning to get things seeded, and then having the imagination and the vision to scale that afterwards, and figuring out paths to scale that is a meaningful approach, is the right thing to do.
Mhm.
So let's take one last question and we'll wrap it up. So Dr. Ronnie Delgrade has asked us, first of all, he said, thanks for an incredible presentation. He's asked us, can you expand on a traction framework for customer retention and share how you recommend setting clear goals ahead to measure success?
Yeah, this one is actually near and dear to my heart. So, what I would recommend is Dave McClure came up with what's called the pirate metrics. So and the reason he calls them pirate metrics is because they spell R, AAARRR. And so, I highly recommend those metrics because that's how we measure a lot of products. And like if we're talking about and I'll kind of go. We use one that's actually by Ward Van Gasteren, I think his name is, which is a little bit of it actually adds one additional A, which is three A's, three R's, and it's awareness, acquisition, activation, retention, revenue, referral. And if you're working in B2B, you'll probably end up flipping retention and revenue because it's very common, obviously, for people to pay before there's actual retention, right? So for us, we use that framework very religiously to measure where are the problems within that funnel because that's a traditional product funnel, right? All the way from awareness all the way to referral. And so you're asking about retention. Retention is one of those key metrics. And so for us, as we're using that funnel, we can actually clearly see if we're having a retention issue, and that a lot of times could be DAU, or MAU, like monthly active users, right? And so determining what that metric is and then measuring it is extremely helpful. As if you use that framework to measure all of the statistics, again, from awareness, where it could be LinkedIn, if you've got LinkedIn impressions and things like that all the way through your funnel, you're able to clearly identify when you're doing your experiments what is making a meaningful impact and what's not. And so that's what we use through the process of building better products. Is the Pirate Metrics framework is a really good framework to use. So
And I would, I guess, add that if you're finding that you're not achieving the customer retention you need, then perhaps it's an opportune moment to figure out a pivot that can get you to that direction.
yep. And what
Would you
what
agree?
that
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. And it's interesting because each part of that funnel tells you something different. So on the awareness side, what it tells you is like your message isn't landing. So it's likely if at the top of the funnel, the message, maybe the problem you're solving isn't resonating, but when you start to get to retention, what that tells me is it tells me your promise isn't strong enough. So the message that brought them there to actually use the product, you're not fulfilling that promise through the product. And so that's where that's what it sounds like maybe needs some work is what is the disconnect between what you say and what you offer. So that would be what I would say is to maybe to dig into that.
Excellent point. And I think that is an outstanding point to wrap things up with and end it. So, because we're a little bit past the top of the hour. So, what I want to do is, first of all, thank you, Josh, for being our guest today and sharing incredible insight with us. Thank you so much. And secondly, I want to thank all of you who have been part of our community here in the audience for your participation. And for those who will watch the recording, thank you also for being a part of this community. And so with that, we'll wrap up our November 2025 webinar and wish you all a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you very much.